There are things that only make sense when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. A single death record means nothing. A name on a ledger means nothing. A signature at the bottom of a coroner's report means nothing unless that same name appears on the next report, and the one after that, and the one after that, for 30 years, across dozens of deaths, in 3 different counties, through wars and epidemics and fires that should have scattered every trail into ash. Someone was always there. Someone whose name kept showing up exactly where it shouldn't. Not as the victim, not as a witness, just there, present, authorized, signed. And nobody noticed, not for 3 decades, because the one thing that makes a secret truly safe isn't hiding it. It's making it look like paperwork. This is the story of Harrow County, Kentucky, and the name that should have stopped appearing long before it finally did. Before we continue with the story of Harrow County, if you're new here, welcome. This channel exists for stories exactly like this one. True, strange, and deeply unsettling. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss one. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? What city? What state? I love knowing who's out there in the dark with me. The county seat of Harrow was a modest, unremarkable place in the eastern hill country of Kentucky. A cluster of buildings pressed into the crook of 2 creeks, surrounded by ridge lines that kept the weather and the outside world at bay in equal measure. By the spring of 1847, it had perhaps 400 permanent residents. 2 churches of competing denominations that shared a graveyard without speaking to one another, a dry goods store, a mill that ran slowly in dry summers, and a courthouse that doubled as a meeting hall, a place of worship when neither congregation had the room, and, occasionally, a courtroom. The county had been formally organized only 12 years before, carved from territory that had itself been carved and recarved several times since statehood. The records it kept were not meticulous. The clerk who maintained them was a man named Hector Vane, who had held the position since the county's incorporation and who ran the office with the particular combination of diligence and laziness that comes from knowing no one is ever going to check your work. Vane was 51 years old in 1847. He was a large man, not in height but in breadth, the kind of build that suggests a history of physical labor that has since gone soft. He had a round, ruddy face, thinning hair combed with deliberate care across the top of his skull, and a habit of speaking very slowly, as if each word needed to be retrieved from some considerable distance before it could be offered up. His handwriting was surprisingly fine for a man of his appearance, precise, upright letters with long, clean descenders, and it was this handwriting that would eventually become the most recognizable thing about him. More recognizable, as it turned out, than his face. The Harrow County Death Ledger for 1847 begins unremarkably. 9 entries in January, most of them elderly men and women. Causes listed in the loose vocabulary of the era: inflammation of the lungs, dropsy, the wasting sickness. Each entry bears the signature of the attending physician, when there was one, and the countersigning clerk, Hector Vane. His name appears 9 times in January, 13 in February, 11 in March. This, of course, was expected. Vane was the county clerk. His name was supposed to be on these documents. He had been signing them for 12 years without incident or comment. What was not expected, what nobody noticed until it was far too late, was that Vane's name was also appearing in places where a county clerk had no particular reason to be. In April of 1847, a man named Robert Ferris died on his property 4 miles east of the county seat. The cause was listed as a fall from a horse. The attending physician was Dr. Clarence Lott, a young man barely 2 years out of a medical college in Ohio, who had come to Harrow County looking for a practice and found one only because the previous doctor had himself died the prior winter, of what Lott, reviewing the records later, could only describe as a complaint I cannot identify from the notes. The death of Robert Ferris was unremarkable in almost every respect. He was 54 years old, a farmer, survived by a wife and 4 children, and a debt at the dry goods store that was not inconsiderable. But at the bottom of the report, alongside Dr. Lott's signature, there was a second notation: a line that read, "Verified and recorded. H. Vane, County Clerk, present at examination of remains." Present at examination of remains. This was unusual. County clerks did not typically attend the examination of remains. Their role was administrative, to receive reports and file them, to ensure the ledger was accurate, to affix the county seal when required. Nothing in the statutes of Kentucky required or even suggested that the county clerk should travel 4 miles into the countryside to stand in a barn while a young physician examined a dead farmer. Dr. Lott, when asked about it later, much later, said that he had found it odd at the time but had not questioned it. Vane had simply appeared at the Ferris property before Lott himself had even been summoned. He had introduced himself, explained that it was county policy for a clerk to be present when an estate of any significance was involved, and had stood quietly in the corner of the barn while Lott conducted his examination. He had asked no questions, he had touched nothing. When Lott was finished, Vane had nodded, made a notation in a small leather-bound book he carried, and left. "I thought nothing of it," Lott said. He seemed to know what he was about. The death of Robert Ferris was followed, in the autumn of the same year, by the death of Martin Ferris, Robert's eldest son, 22 years old, cause listed as fever of the brain. And again, at the bottom of the report, signed in that same precise upright hand, H. Vane, County Clerk, present at examination. 2 Ferrises, father and son, within 6 months. Hector Vane present at both. The Ferris property, which had been the largest privately held tract of arable land in that part of the county, passed entirely to creditors within 18 months. The widow remarried. The younger children scattered. The land was eventually purchased at auction, at a price well below its assessed value, by a land company whose articles of incorporation had been filed with the Harrow County Clerk's office 4 months before Robert Ferris's fall from his horse. The filing clerk for that incorporation was Hector Vane. None of this was visible from inside a single ledger. None of it was visible from inside a single year. It was the kind of pattern that only becomes a pattern across decades, and the only way to see it across decades was to have access to all the records at once, and to be looking for something specific. No one was looking, not yet. The years between 1848 and 1855 were not quiet ones in Kentucky, or indeed in the nation. The Mexican War had ended, leaving a generation of young men returned from a foreign country with habits and expectations that did not fit neatly back into rural county life. The debate over slavery, which had simmered beneath the surface of everything for as long as anyone could remember, was beginning to boil. Kentucky was a border state in spirit as well as geography. It would never fully commit to either side of the question, which meant it was never fully at peace with itself. And this ambient unease settled into the social fabric of places like Harrow County, like damp settling into old wood. Into all of this, Hector Vane continued to do his work. He was re-elected county clerk in 1848 without opposition. The position paid little and required much, and no one else wanted it. He was re-elected again in 1852. By this point, his tenure had lasted long enough that people had simply stopped thinking of the county clerk's office as something separate from the man who occupied it. Vane was the records. He was the ledgers, the land deeds, the incorporation filings, the death registers, the marriage licenses, the tax rolls. He was the living institutional memory of Harrow County, and he cultivated this impression with quiet, relentless care. He knew things about people. This was in itself unremarkable. Clerks always know things about people because the records they maintain are an archive of every legally significant moment in a community's life. But Vane knew things specifically, and he deployed this knowledge with a precision that was, to anyone who thought about it clearly, slightly unnerving. He would mention, in casual conversation, a detail from a deed filed 15 years before. He would know, without being told, that a man's father had died intestate, and that there were therefore questions about the inheritance that had never been formally resolved. He would know who owed whom and by how much and since when. People found this impressive rather than troubling. It seemed like evidence of his dedication, his thoroughness, his care for the county and its citizens. It took a particular kind of mind to see it differently, to look at that encyclopedic memory and ask not why does he know so much, but what is he doing with it. In the spring of 1851, a farmer named Alton Greer died of what was recorded as inflammation of the stomach. He was 63 years old, a widower, with one surviving child, a daughter, Margaret, 28, unmarried, who lived with him on the family property. The property was substantial, 240 acres of bottom land along the Eastern Creek, well-watered and productive, assessed at nearly 3 times the value of most comparable tracts in the county. Dr. Lott attended the death of Alton Greer. Hector Vane was, again, present at the examination of remains. His notation in the ledger was identical to the one he had made in 1847. Verified and recorded, H. Vane, county clerk, present at examination of remains. Margaret Greer, when she came to the courthouse 6 weeks after her father's death to file the estate paperwork, found that several things were already in order. The will, which she had never seen executed in its final form, had been filed with the county clerk's office 2 years before her father's death. It left the property to her outright, which she had expected, but it also stipulated that if she died or sold the property within 10 years, the proceeds should be divided between a list of charitable organizations. She recognized none of the organizations on the list. Neither did anyone else in Harrow County. When she asked Vane about this, he was helpful, patient, and deeply unhelpful. He showed her the document. He showed her the filing date. He confirmed her father's signature. He explained at some length the legal provisions for charitable bequests under Kentucky law. He expressed his sympathy for her loss. What he did not explain was how the charitable organizations listed in the will, 4 of them, had all been incorporated through the Harrow County Clerk's office within the last 8 years. Or that the named agent for each organization was a different man in each case, none of whom lived in Harrow County, but all of whose names appeared in the clerk's records in connection with land transactions that had, over the previous decade, significantly expanded the holdings of a single, privately held land company, the same one that had purchased the Ferris property. Margaret Greer never sold. She worked the land herself, hired 2 men from the neighboring county, and built a life there that she had not expected to be building alone. She was sharp and capable and quietly furious in the way that people are when they have understood that something is wrong but cannot articulate exactly what. She watched Vane. She filed her taxes on time and in person so that she could watch him. She noted his habits, his hours, his visitors. She said nothing to anyone because she had nothing concrete to say, and because she was a woman alone on a piece of land that several powerful interests had already demonstrated they wanted, and she understood that speaking without proof is not courage. It is exposure. She was still watching in 1855, when the 3rd member of the Ferris family, Robert Ferris's 2nd son James, who had returned to the county after several years away, was found dead in the creek at the eastern edge of what had once been the family property. The cause was listed as drowning. Hector Vane was present at the examination of remains. By that point, Vane's name had appeared on the death records of 11 Harrow County residents over 8 years. 11. His precise handwriting at the bottom of each report, that same notation, verified and recorded, H. Vane, county clerk, present at examination. And behind each of those 11 deaths, if you looked, really looked, through the land records and the incorporation filings and the will contests and the tax assessments, was a transaction. Property moved, money changed hands in directions that were not obvious. Old claims were satisfied, and new ones quietly established. Margaret Greer was 42 years old in 1855. She had a small leather-bound book of her own by then, in which she had been writing down what she had observed. Not accusations, not theories, just dates, names, and facts. The kind of record that a county clerk would recognize. She was waiting for the right person to show it to. She would wait 13 more years. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad reached Harrow County in the autumn of 1863, in the middle of a war that had torn the state in half without quite making it fall. Kentucky had declared its neutrality, and then watched that neutrality be violated by both sides in turn. Confederate troops moving north across its southern border, and Union forces responding from the river towns, and the people of the interior counties had learned to hold very still and say very little, and wait to see whose army was closest on any given morning. The railroad changed things. It always did. It brought commerce and strangers and the particular anxiety of connection, the sudden awareness among people who had lived for a generation in a world bounded by ridge and creek that the rest of the country was very close and getting closer. Among the strangers the railroad brought to Harrow County was a man named Thomas Reed. Reed was 34 years old, lean and fair, with the kind of precise, careful manner that suggested either a legal education or a very good approximation of one. He was, in fact, a journalist, a correspondent for a Louisville paper called the Evening Chronicle, which was at that point attempting to distinguish itself from its competitors by covering not just the war, but the home front, the economic disruptions, the land disputes, the community fractures that the war was widening, but that had begun long before the first shot was fired. Reed had been sent to Harrow County on what his editor described, with some skepticism, as a land story. There had been complaints filed with the state land office, irregularities in property transfers across several counties in the eastern hill country, patterns that suggested something more systematic than simple opportunism. His editor did not believe there was much to it. Reed had 2 weeks. He arrived on a Tuesday in October 1863 in a county that was simultaneously trying to manage the ordinary business of civilian life and the extraordinary disruptions of a war that had emptied it of most of its young men. He found lodging at the inn, asked around about who knew the county history, and was directed by 3 separate people to Margaret Greer. The first time Reed visited her property, she stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. She was, by then, 50 years old. She had the look of a woman who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had not yet decided whether what had finally arrived was it. "You're from the newspaper," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "You're looking into land records." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him a moment longer, then stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I have been waiting for someone to come in for 8 years." What Margaret Greer showed Thomas Reed that afternoon was not the leather-bound book. Not immediately. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had been holding a secret carefully for a long time, that the most important thing was not to give it all at once. She told him about her father, about the will with the charitable organization she had never recognized, about the Ferris family, father and son, and then the younger boy in the creek. She spoke quietly and without visible emotion, the way you speak about facts rather than grievances, because she had known from the beginning that grievances could be dismissed and facts could not. Reed listened. He had a reporter's way of listening, very still, very focused, with occasional small questions that pulled the thread a little further without tugging hard enough to break it. "How many deaths?" he asked, when she had finished the main body of what she had to say. 11 that I know of, between 1847 and 1855, she said. "I stopped counting. I stopped being able to count with certainty because after 1855 he became more careful. The notations stopped appearing in the records." Reed looked up from his notes. "He stopped signing himself as present?" "He stopped leaving a written record of his presence. That is not the same thing." Reed sat with that for a moment. What changed in 1855? Margaret Greer was quiet for a beat that was slightly too long to be simply thoughtful. "I began asking questions in public," she said. "Not about him specifically. About the charitable organizations in my father's will. I wrote letters to the state capitol. I asked about their legal standing." She looked at her hands. 2 weeks after I sent the first letter, the fence on the south edge of my property was broken in 3 places. My hired men found my dog dead in the morning. It was winter. There had been a snow, and there were boot prints in the snow that were not mine and not theirs. Reed wrote this down. "And then?" he said. "And then I stopped asking questions in public," she said. But I did not stop watching. What she had been watching in the years since 1855 was a change in method. The death notations had stopped, but the pattern had not. It had simply become less visible. The land transfers continued, quieter now, routed through intermediaries, sometimes involving properties in neighboring counties where Vane's name had no formal standing. The charitable organizations had been dissolved one by one and replaced with others. The land company had restructured twice, changing its name and its principles each time while remaining in substance the same entity. She had tracked all of it, not because she was certain she was right, but because she was certain enough that she could not stop. "And Vane," Reed said. "How old is he now?" 67, she said. "Still clerk. He has been clerk for 28 years. Reed looked down at his notes, then he looked up. "Why hasn't anyone else seen this?" Margaret Greer looked at him with something that was not quite contempt and not quite pity. The look of someone who has asked themselves the same question many times and found the answer each time both perfectly obvious and deeply insufficient. "Because the records are his," she said, "and because he is very good at his work. Before we go any further, I want to say this. The people who piece together the truth in stories like this one are never the powerful ones. They're always the ones who were told to be quiet and didn't quite manage it. If that kind of story speaks to you, this channel has many more. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. I want to know what you think is really going on here. Do you trust Margaret Greer? Do you think Thomas Reed is in over his head?" Thomas Reed spent the next 11 days in Harrow County. He slept 4 hours a night, and the rest of the time he read. The clerk's office opened at 7 in the morning. Reed was on the steps at 6:45, and he remained there in the small room that smelled of old paper and tallow for as many hours as Vane would permit, which was, to Reed's slight surprise, nearly all of them. Vane did not obstruct him. He was cooperative, patient, and helpful in the deliberate way of a man who has decided that cooperation is the correct strategy. He answered questions readily. He retrieved ledgers without complaint. He offered context and historical background with the ease of a man who has spent 30 years in the same room. "You have been clerk for a long time," Reed said on the second morning. 28 years, Vane agreed, without any particular inflection. He was standing at a shelf, replacing a ledger. His back was to Reed. "The county has not produced many candidates for the office. Do you enjoy the work?" Vane turned and looked at him. His face was still round and ruddy, but it had grown heavier with the years. His eyes were a pale, faded blue, the kind of blue that looks almost transparent in certain lights. "It's an honest trade," he said. "The records don't argue back." Reed spent the first 3 days establishing the pattern that Margaret Greer had described. He found it exactly where she said he would. In the death ledgers, in the land records, in the incorporation filings. He found Vane's notation in 11 death reports between 1847 and 1855. He mapped the property transfers that followed each death, tracing them through the intermediaries and the restructured entities to the land company, which by 1863 operated under the name of the Harrow Valley Land and Improvements Trust. The trust held, by his count, slightly more than 4,000 acres of Harrow County land. He could not determine, from the available records, what it intended to do with this land or who ultimately controlled it. The principals listed on the trust's most recent incorporation were men whose names he did not recognize and who were not residents of Harrow County. On the 4th day, he found something that Margaret Greer had not told him about because she had not known about it. In a ledger from 1849, a property tax assessment ledger that would not typically have contained anything of interest, there was a notation in Vane's hand at the bottom of an otherwise routine page that read, "See also Pendleton, 1848. That was all. See also Pendleton, 1848. No explanation. No context. Just the name and a date range with no end. Pendleton County was 80 miles to the west, across the ridges and along the river. Reed did not know at first whether this meant Pendleton County specifically or a person named Pendleton. He wrote it down and kept going. On the 6th day, he found the second name. This required looking not in the death ledger itself, but in the margin of a page in the records of the Harrow County Circuit Court. A page from an 1853 probate proceeding relating to the estate of a man named Jacob Holt, who had died of the stomach complaint in the summer of that year, and whose small farm on the northern ridge had subsequently been acquired by a company that Reed's mapping exercise had already connected to the trust. The probate record was routine, but in the margin, in ink slightly different from the body text added after the main document had dried, there was a name, not Vane's name, a name Reed had not seen before, W. Crane. Just that. No first name spelled out, no title or designation, just W. Crane, written in a hand that was not Vane's, slightly heavier, with a different character to the capital letters. Reed copied it into his notes and said nothing. On the 7th day, he asked Vane, as casually as he could manage, whether the clerk's office maintained records of its interactions with other county offices in the state. "What do you mean by interactions?" Vane asked. "Correspondence, professional exchanges, when records from another county are relevant to a Harrow County matter, for instance." "There is a correspondence file," Vane said, "in the back room. It is not organized in any way that would be useful to a journalist. I'd like to look at it if that's all right." Vane looked at him for a long moment. "It is all right," he said. The correspondence file was not organized in any way that would be useful to anyone. It was a wooden crate, approximately 2 feet deep, containing what appeared to be 20 years of miscellaneous letters, receipts, notifications and official communications, none of it sorted, much of it faded or water-damaged. Reed spent 4 hours in the back room working through it methodically. He found 8 letters addressed to Hector Vane from a county clerk's office in Pendleton County, dated between 1848 and 1856. They were formal in language, concerned with technical matters of record-keeping and inter-county coordination. The name signed at the bottom of each letter was Walter Crane, Deputy Clerk, Pendleton County, Walter Crane, W. Crane. Reed sat very still in the back room of the Harrow County Courthouse for a full minute, listening to the sounds of the building around him, the distant creak of the main room's floorboards, the scratch of Vane's pen, the muffled sound of wind off the ridges. Then he packed his notes very carefully and went back to his lodgings and wrote a letter to a contact in Louisville, asking for whatever information could be found about the Pendleton County Clerk's office and its records for the years 1848 through 1863. He also wrote a letter to Margaret Greer. "I found something," he wrote. "Not what we expected, something larger. I need 3 more days." 3 more days became 3 more weeks. The letter Reed received from his Louisville contact arrived on the 11th of November, 1863, and it was brief. His contact had been unable to locate detailed records from Pendleton County, as the courthouse there had suffered a fire in 1858 that had destroyed much of the archives. But his contact had found one thing, which he mentioned almost as an afterthought: a listing in the Kentucky State Directory for 1857, showing that the deputy clerk of Pendleton County was one Walter Crane, and that the county clerk, Crane's superior, had resigned that year under unspecified circumstances and had not been replaced for over a year. A fire in 1858 that destroyed much of the archives. Reed looked at this for a long time. He then wrote to the state capitol, requesting information about county clerk offices in every Kentucky county that had experienced significant archival losses due to fire or flood in the period 1840 to 1865. He was not hopeful about a rapid response. It was 1863 and the state government had other things on its mind, but he sent the letter. While he waited, he returned to the Harrow County records with a different question. Not who died and what property transferred. He had mapped that as thoroughly as the records permitted. The new question was simpler and, in its way, more frightening. How many people with access to official records had Hector Vane ever worked alongside, trained, or maintained a formal professional relationship with? The answer, compiled over 5 days of cross-referencing correspondence files, court records, and the county's records of official appointments and elections, was 23. 23 individuals in the state of Kentucky who at one point or another over the previous 28 years had been in a position of either dependency on Vane's expertise or professional connection to his office. Not all of them were clerks. Some were circuit court judges, some were justices of the peace. Some were county assessors or surveyors, positions that, like the clerk's office, touched the records of land and death. Of the 23, Reed was able to determine the current status of all but 3. 2 of the unaccounted ones had simply disappeared from the records, moved away presumably, though no forwarding address or subsequent filing appeared in any county he had access to. The third was Walter Crane. Crane's last appearance in any official record Reed could locate was a filing in Pendleton County dated March of 1858, 3 months before the courthouse fire. After that, nothing. No resignation notice, no listing in any subsequent state directory, no death record in Pendleton County, or none that had survived the fire. Reed wrote in his notebook, W. Crane, disappeared 1858. Courthouse fire, 1858. Connected to H. Vane by correspondence, 1848, 1856. Notation in Harrow County margin, also 1848. Unknown significance. He sat at the small desk in his lodgings and looked at what he had written. The candle on the desk guttered in a draught from the window, and the shadows in the corners of the room moved in a way that was entirely natural and felt, in that moment, entirely wrong. Margaret Greer came to town the following morning. She sat across from him in the inn's front room and listened while he laid out, carefully and in order, everything he had found. She was very still through all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Pendleton County, she said. I don't know anything about Pendleton County. Nobody from here would, Reed said. It's not connected to Harrow County in any obvious way. The geography is wrong for trade routes or migration. The only connection I've been able to establish is Vane. And Crane. And Crane. She looked at the table. You think it's bigger than one county? I think it's been bigger than one county for a long time, Reed said. I think Harrow County is one piece of something. I think the land company here, the trust, is one piece of a larger structure, and I think whatever Vane knows about it, Walter Crane knew too. And Crane is gone. Crane is gone. Margaret Greer was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, My father trusted Hector Vane. He knew him for 30 years before he died. He let him handle the filing of the will. He spoke of him as a reliable man. Reed nodded. He was reliable, she said. That's exactly what he was. He was the most reliable person in the county. He was always there. He always knew everything. He always knew exactly what to do. She paused. I have thought many times about whether a man can be both perfectly reliable and perfectly criminal, and I have concluded that these are not as different as they seem. Reed looked at her. He is reliable about getting things done, she said, whatever those things are. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Harrow County only deepens. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries, and hit that like button to support this channel. We are barely halfway through, and the worst of what Hector Vane has been doing is only just beginning to come into focus. Stay with me. The response from the state capitol arrived in early December 1863. It was not a comprehensive document. The state archivist's office, in the middle of a war, had had neither the time nor the staff to conduct a thorough investigation. But it was enough. The letter listed 11 Kentucky counties that had experienced significant archival losses in the period 1840-1865. Of these, 5 had lost their records to fire. 2 had lost them to flood. 1 had lost them to a fire that had, according to the notation in the state records, been attributed to accident or negligence. 3 had experienced losses that were less specifically documented, records described as missing, misplaced, or destroyed in the removal process. Reed mapped these 11 counties against the list of 23 individuals he had identified as being connected to Vane. 7 of the 11 counties with archival losses had a current or former connection to one of Vane's 23 associates. 7 out of 11. This was not proof of anything, legally or journalistically. Records were lost all the time, by accident, by neglect, by the ordinary entropy of institutions that did not have the resources to maintain them properly. Fires happened, floods happened. But 7 out of 11, across a period of 23 years, in a pattern that mapped consistently onto a network of professional relationships centered on a single man. Reed spent an entire evening arguing with himself about whether he was seeing a pattern or constructing one. This was the central dilemma of his profession, and he was honest enough to feel it genuinely, rather than simply as a rhetorical exercise. He went back to the records. In the Harrow County Land Assessment Ledger for 1856, he found something he had passed over before without registering its full significance. A correction. A formal amendment to a prior entry executed in Vane's hand, relating to a parcel of land that had been assessed in 1847 at a value considerably higher than its eventual sale price. The correction reduced the assessed value retroactively, and it was dated 3 years after the original assessment. Retroactive corrections to land assessments were not, in themselves, illegal. They were, however, unusual, and they required the signature of the county assessor, as well as the clerk. The assessor whose signature appeared on this correction was a man named Gideon Parks, who had held the assessor's position since 1851. Reed had placed Parks on his list of 23. He was one of the men whose professional relationship with Vane went back many years, and whose office, like Vane's, touched the fundamental records of property and value in the county. Reed looked at what he had and made a decision. He requested a meeting with Gideon Parks. Parks agreed to see him the following afternoon, at the assessor's office in the courthouse building. He was a small, neat man of perhaps 60, with a careful, watchful manner and the slight tremor in his hands of someone under chronic stress. He answered Reed's preliminary questions, about the county, about his office, about land records in general, with the cooperative vagueness of a man who knows more than he's saying, but has not yet decided how much to say. Then Reed asked him about the 1856 correction. Parks went very still. "That is a routine amendment," he said after a moment. "The original assessment and the corrected value are substantially different," Reed said. "Assessments are sometimes revised. 3 years after the fact." Parks looked at his hands. The tremor was slightly more visible. "Mr. Parks," Reed said carefully, "I am not here to write about you. I'm trying to understand a pattern of activity that has been going on in this county for a long time, and I believe it has happened, in somewhat similar form, in other counties in this state. I am not asking you to accuse anyone, or put your name to anything. I am asking you to help me understand what I am looking at." Parks was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light was coming through the narrow window of the office, catching the dust in the air, and outside there was the sound of a cart going down the main street and someone calling out to someone else. "The correction was not my idea," Parks said finally. His voice was very low. Reed waited. "I was told the original figure was in error," Parks said. "I was told it needed to be adjusted. I was told this was a standard procedure." "Who told you?" Parks looked up. His eyes in the light were the color of old paper. "You already know," he said. Reed wrote down nothing in that moment. He kept very still. "Did this happen more than once?" he asked. Parks looked back at his hands. "I have been assessor for 12 years, he said. "In 12 years I have made 17 corrections to prior assessments." Reed looked at him. "How many of those corrections did you initiate yourself?" Another long silence. 3, Parks said. "The others were—" He stopped. "Requested," Reed said. Parks said nothing, but he did not deny it. "Were there others?" Reed asked. "Not assessors. Others who received requests like yours? Parks looked at the window, at the dust moving in the afternoon light, at the ordinary street sounds outside. You need to understand what this county was like before the war, he said. How few men there were who held positions of any responsibility. How much any one of them depended on the cooperation of the others. If the clerk says a thing is so, the assessor does not easily say it is not. If the clerk has been in his position for 20 years, and you have been in yours for 2, you don't— He stopped again. You don't find it easy to question him? No, Reed said. And once you've done a thing once, Parks said, you have done it. That is the other part of it. Once you have done a thing that is not right, you are no longer in a position to object to the next one. Reed sat with that for a moment. Then he said, the deaths, the ones where he was present. Parks turned back to look at him. Something in his face shifted. A change not of expression but of quality, as if the air around him had changed temperature. I don't know anything about that, he said. His voice was different now, quiet and absolute. I don't know anything about that, and I won't speak about it. Mr. Parks, that is the end of what I will say, Parks said. I have told you more than I should have. I have told you more than I intended to. He stood, signaling that the meeting was over. Reed stood too. One question, Reed said. Just one. Parks waited. How many people in this county? Reed said. Do you know what you know? Gideon Parks looked at him for a long moment. His hands were no longer trembling, which was somehow more disturbing than when they had been. Enough, he said. And none of them have said a word in 12 years. Think about what that means. What it meant, Reed thought, walking back to his lodgings in the grey December afternoon, was that the silence had been cultivated as carefully as everything else. Not just through fear, though fear was certainly part of it, but through something more subtle and more durable, through complicity, through the slow accumulation of small compromises that bound each person to the silence by their own participation in it. This was not a new observation. Reed had covered political corruption before, had seen the mechanisms of organized dishonesty in city governments and railroad companies and legislative bodies. But there was something different about what he was looking at here. Something smaller in scale and therefore, in a way, more disturbing. This was not the grand corruption of great institutions. This was the corruption of the ordinary, the everyday, the unremarkable. It was built not into boardrooms and legislatures, but into the small wooden offices of county courthouses, into the routines of men who knew each other's names and had dinner at each other's tables and sat next to each other in church. He returned to Margaret Greer the following morning. She listened to his account of the meeting with Parks, with the careful attention she brought to all information, absorbing it, weighing it, setting it in the context of what she already knew. 17 corrections, she said, in 12 years. And 14 of them were not his. So he says. She nodded slowly. What I never understood, she said, was how Vane knew which properties to target. The ones he went after were not random. They were the best land in the county, or the most strategically located. He didn't come to my father's property by accident. He came because it was the right land. She paused. Who was telling him which properties to go after? Reed looked at her. Think about it from the other direction, she said. Vane is the clerk. He knows the records. But knowing which land is valuable is different from knowing which land is available, which owners are in debt, which are sick, which have disputes that could be exploited. That's the assessor's knowledge. The assessor would know who couldn't pay their taxes, who was overextended, who had contested claims. Reed sat with that for a moment. So Parks was not just processing the corrections. He was identifying the targets, she said. Or someone in his office was. And then Vane did the rest. But Parks said he didn't know about the deaths. Parks said he won't speak about the deaths, she said. Which is not the same thing. Reed looked out the window at the winter fields. I need more, he said. I have patterns, and I have a partial confession from an assessor who will never repeat it publicly. I need something in the records that connects directly. Margaret Greer was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There is something I have not shown you yet. She had been keeping it, she explained, because she had not been certain she could trust him. Not with his intentions, which she had assessed fairly quickly, but with his judgment about when to use it. She had learned in 13 years of watching that information released at the wrong moment was worse than information withheld, because it warned the wrong people and gave them time to respond. But she had made her assessment now, and she had decided the time was right. She reached into the bag she had brought with her and produced the leather-bound book. It was smaller than Reed had imagined, the size of a hand, not quite as thick as his thumb. The cover was worn and slightly warped with age, and the pages, when she opened it, were dense with her small, clear handwriting. Dates, names, observations, the record she had been keeping since 1847, when she had first begun to notice. But it was not the observations that she wanted to show him. It was something she had found in the back of the book, tucked between the last written page and the back cover. A folded paper, creased and recreased many times, the ink slightly faded but still legible. It was a letter, undated, but the paper and ink were consistent with the late 1840s. It was addressed to no one, and it was unsigned. But the handwriting, the upright, precise letters with the long, clean descenders, was unmistakably Hector Vane's. The arrangement is as we discussed. The trust will receive transfer of the Ferris East parcel no later than 6 months following. The physician has been briefed and will note causes consistent with natural illness. Parks has been notified of the assessment adjustment. Crane confirms the Pendleton matter is settled. No further correspondence on this matter should be committed to paper by any party. Reed read it twice. Then he read it again. "Where did you get this?" he said. "My father's desk," she said. "After he died, it was in a drawer with some old correspondence he had kept. I did not understand what it meant until much later. By that time, I understood well enough not to show it to anyone in this county." Reed looked at the letter. No further correspondence on this matter should be committed to paper by any party. And here was a letter. Committed to paper. The single piece of evidence that should not exist by Vane's own directive. "He gave this to your father," Reed said. "Or my father found it," she said. "Or someone gave it to my father intending for him to find it. I don't know. I have never been able to determine that part. Why would Vane write something like this down at all if he was being so careful?" Margaret Greer looked at him steadily. "That is the question I have asked myself for 16 years, she said. "And the only answer I have is that at the time he wrote it, he believed he was the only person who would ever see it." Thomas Reed returned to Louisville on the 23rd of December, 1863, carrying his notes, the letter, which Margaret Greer had allowed him to take only after he had agreed to 3 specific conditions about how and when it could be used, and the weight of something he had not fully expected to find. He had come to Harrow County looking for a land story. He had found something that was, on its surface, exactly that. A story about land, about the way it moved from the living to the dead, to the powerful through mechanisms that looked at every individual step like ordinary commerce and ordinary record-keeping. But beneath that surface, in the space between the documents and the facts they described, he had found something else. He had found a system, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a meeting in a candlelit room where powerful men plotted in low voices. Something more banal and therefore more durable. A set of habits and relationships and understandings that had grown up over decades among men who occupied positions of small but significant power, who had learned, one small compromise at a time, what it was possible to do with those positions without ever formally agreeing to do it. He spent January and February of 1864 in the Louisville offices of the Evening Chronicle, writing and rewriting and discarding and rewriting. His editor, a man named Harris, who had been skeptical from the beginning, read the drafts with increasing discomfort. "This is very serious," Harris said after reading the 4th draft. "Yes," Reed said. "You have one piece of documentary evidence. The letter. I have the letter, Parks's partial testimony, the pattern in the records, and 17 years of documented observation by a credible witness. The letter is unsigned and undated. The handwriting is Vane's. I can establish that. Harris looked at the draft on his desk. If we publish this and we're wrong about any part of it, we're not wrong, Reed said. If we publish this and appear to be wrong, Harris said, or if Vane has any kind of recourse. He'll have recourse, Reed said. He has had recourse for 30 years. He'll use it. But the record is the record. I've mapped it. It's there. Harris sat with the draft for a long time. Outside the window, the city went about its business in the gray January cold. Carts and voices and the distant sound of the river. You say this extends beyond Harrow County, Harris said. I believe it does. I can only fully document Harrow County with what I have now. But the pattern with Walter Crane and Pendleton County, the notation in the margin, the lost records, it suggests at minimum a second county, and possibly more. How many more? Reed looked at him. That's the part I can't determine yet. I need access to records that may not exist anymore in counties where the archives have been... He paused. Managed. Harris looked at him sharply. You're saying the missing archives are not coincidental. I'm saying that 7 of the 11 counties in Kentucky, with significant archival losses between 1840 and 1865, have documented connections to men who had professional relationships with Hector Vane. I'm saying that when records disappear, and the only person left who knew what was in them is the person with a motive to make them disappear, it is worth asking the question. Harris was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, We'll need a lawyer. I expected that. And we can't publish while the war is still. The war will end, Reed said. When it does, I want to be ready. He was ready when it ended. The 5th draft of the article was complete by July of 1865, 3 months after Appomattox. It ran in the Evening Chronicle on August 14, 1865, under Reed's name, across the front page and 2 full inside pages. The headline read, The Harrow Record, 30 years of deaths, land transfers, and 1 signature that appears in all of it. Hector Vane read the article on the morning of August 16th. He had received a copy through the regular mail, the newspaper folded and addressed in the ordinary way, as if it were any other piece of correspondence. He read it at his desk, in the office where he had spent 30 years, surrounded by the ledgers and files and records that bore his handwriting on nearly every page. He read it slowly, with the same careful attention he brought to all documents. When he finished, he set it on the desk and sat very still for a long moment. Then he took out a sheet of paper and began to write. What he wrote was not a denial. It was a response, and the distinction was significant. He addressed it to the editor of the Evening Chronicle, and it ran to 6 pages. In it, he did not deny the facts Reed had reported. The presence of his name on the death records, the existence of the letter, the pattern of land transfers, the involvement of Parks and Crane. Instead, he contextualized them. He acknowledged that he had been present at the examination of remains on multiple occasions. He explained that this was a practice he had adopted following a dispute in 1847 about the valuation of an estate, in which an error in the physician's report had led to a legal complication that had taken years to resolve. To prevent future errors, he had made it his practice, when a death involved property of significance to the county records, to attend the examination personally. This was not, he noted, required by statute, but neither was it prohibited. He acknowledged that he had had a professional relationship with Walter Crane of Pendleton County. He described this as an ordinary correspondence between county clerks, undertaken for the purpose of aligning record-keeping practices between neighboring jurisdictions. He acknowledged that the trust had acquired land in Harrow County over many years. He explained that he had served, in an unofficial advisory capacity, as a consultant to the trust on matters of county land records. This was, he acknowledged, a conflict of interest that he should have disclosed, and he expressed regret that he had not done so. He said nothing about the letter. He addressed it only in a single sentence, noting that the document attributed to my hand has been removed from its context and its meaning misrepresented. He said nothing about the deaths. The response was brilliant in its way, measured, reasonable, conceding enough to seem credible without conceding anything that could be used against him. Harris read it and said, with a mixture of frustration and professional admiration, that Vane had clearly spent time in his life reading legal documents. Reed read it and felt something cold settle in his stomach, not because the response undermined his reporting. It didn't, and both of them knew it, but because it was the response of a man who had done this before, who had faced scrutiny before and had survived it, and who understood from experience exactly how much to concede and exactly how much to withhold. The response was published. And then the other thing happened. 3 days after Vane's response appeared in the Chronicle, Gideon Parks resigned as county assessor. He cited health reasons. He left Harrow County within the week and did not give a forwarding address. The week after that, the offices of the Evening Chronicle received a letter from a legal firm in Frankfort, Kentucky, representing, as it turned out, not Hector Vane personally, but the Harrow Valley Land and Improvements Trust. The letter alleged that the article constituted defamation and demanded a retraction. Harris summoned Reed to his office. "We are not retracting," Reed said. "No," Harris agreed, "but we're going to court." "Good," Reed said, "because that means the records become part of a legal proceeding, public record. They can't be managed once they're in a proceeding." Harris looked at him. "You thought they might try to manage the records?" "They have been managing records for 30 years, Reed said. "That is the entire story." The lawsuit was filed in October of 1865 and proceeded with the glacial pace of Kentucky civil litigation in the immediate post-war period. Courts were backed up. Lawyers were unavailable. Witnesses were scattered. But the lawsuit had the effect Reed had predicted. It forced the records into a formal legal context, where they could not be altered without detection and where their contents became, in a limited but real sense, public property. And in that context, a second journalist became interested in the story. Her name was Eliza Dorn, and she worked for a small but ambitious paper in Cincinnati, Ohio, called the Western Intelligencer. She had read Reed's original article and had been following the lawsuit with interest, and she had done something Reed had not. She had gone to Pendleton County. The courthouse fire of 1858 had destroyed most of the Pendleton County records, but not all of them. Some had been removed before the fire, for reasons that the subsequent investigation, which Dorn noted in her first letter to Reed had been remarkably brief and inconclusive, had never clearly explained. These removed records had been taken to the home of the county judge, who had died in 1861, whose widow had died in 1864, and whose estate had been administered by, it took a moment for Reed to absorb this, a land company incorporated in Pendleton County in 1857, whose listed agent was a man named J. Holt. J. Holt. Jacob Holt of Harrow County had died in 1853, but the name was not so unusual. It could be coincidence. Dawn did not think it was coincidence. She had found, in the ruins of a barn that had once been the primary storage facility for the county judge's estate, a water-damaged box containing approximately 40 pages of miscellaneous Pendleton County records, including 17 death reports from the years 1849 through 1857. 14 of those 17 death reports bore, at the bottom, a notation. Not in Vane's handwriting. Vane was 80 miles away. But the same notation in a different hand, verified and recorded, W. Crane, deputy clerk, present at examination of remains. Walter Crane had been doing in Pendleton County exactly what Vane had been doing in Harrow County. 14 deaths in 8 years, all of them involving property that had subsequently transferred to a land company that was, through a chain of incorporations and restructurings, connected to the Harrow Valley Land and Improvements Trust. Eliza Dorn's article appeared in the Western Intelligencer in February of 1866, and it named Crane directly as Vane's counterpart and probable collaborator. It also asked, in explicit terms, what had happened to Walter Crane after March of 1858. The question was answered, In a sense, 3 months later, when the body of a man was found during the construction of a railroad spur near the Pendleton County line at a depth of approximately 6 feet. The body was too far decomposed for certain identification, but the clothing and personal effects, including a pocket watch with an engraving on the back and a brass badge from the Pendleton County Clerk's office, suggested it was a man who had been in his late 30s at the time of death. Walter Crane had disappeared in early 1858. The fire had followed in the summer of that year. The circuit court judge handling Reed's case, upon reviewing Dawn's article and the news of the discovery, extended the scope of the proceeding. The trial, when it finally came in the spring of 1868, was not what Thomas Reed had imagined it would be. He had imagined confrontation, the satisfaction of watching the evidence laid out before a judge and jury, watching Vane's careful edifice of reasonable explanation finally collapse under the accumulated weight of the record. He had been a journalist long enough to know that the truth, when properly documented, had a weight to it that was hard to deny. But the legal system was not a newspaper, and the standards were different, and the men in the courtroom brought with them all the complications of the world they had come from. Hector Vane, now 82 years old, sat at the defense table with the patience of a man who has outlasted everything before and intends to outlast this. He had hired the best lawyer in Frankfurt, a man named Clement Davis, whose reputation for dismantling circumstantial evidence was formidable. Davis spent the first 3 days of the trial methodically challenging the authenticity and provenance of every document Reed had assembled, not necessarily arguing that they were fraudulent, but planting the seed of uncertainty about each one. The letter, Margaret Greer's letter, Vane's letter, the one that should not have existed, was the crux of the evidentiary dispute. Davis argued that its handwriting could not be definitively attributed to Vane, that its lack of date or signature made it useless as direct evidence, and that its provenance, found in a dead man's desk by his daughter, held in private for 16 years, gave ample opportunity for alteration or fabrication. Margaret Greer testified on the third day. She was now 55 years old. She walked to the witness stand with the composure of a woman who had been preparing for this moment in one form or another since the morning she had found her father's will, and stood in this very courthouse asking a younger Hector Vane what the charitable organizations listed in it were. She answered Davis's questions directly and without flinching. She did not embellish. She did not speculate. She reported what she had observed, with dates and details, and when she did not know something she said so with the same clarity she brought to what she did know. Davis questioned her for 2 hours and did not shake her. On the stand, she looked at Vane once, directly and without expression. He looked back at her with his pale, faded eyes and an expression that was equally without expression, and for a moment the courtroom was very quiet. The jury deliberated for 4 days. The verdict, when it came, was both a result and a disappointment. The civil defamation suit, which had been the nominal framework for the entire proceeding, was decided in favor of the Evening Chronicle and Thomas Reed, meaning the article stood and no retraction was required. This was a victory of record. But the broader implications, the question of what Vane had actually done, of who had died and why, of what the trust had been and how it had operated, these questions the court could not fully answer from a civil defamation case. The judge, in his findings, noted that the evidence raised serious and credible concerns about the conduct of the county clerk's office over a period of decades, and recommended that the Kentucky Attorney General's office conduct a formal investigation. The Attorney General's investigation was announced the following month. It ran for 2 years. The Attorney General's investigation, which concluded in the autumn of 1870, produced a document that ran to over 300 pages and was formally titled Report on the Administration of the Harrow County Clerk's Office and Related Matters, 1835 1868. Thomas Reed obtained a copy on the day of its release and read it in his office in Louisville over the course of 2 days, making notes in the margins. What he found was what he had expected to find, and what he had expected to find was worse than what most people had been prepared to hear. The investigation had confirmed, through independent analysis of the Harrow County records, that 31 deaths recorded in the county between 1847 and 1865 had involved the presence of Hector Vane at the examination of remains. Of these 31, 24 had been followed by property transfers that could be traced to the trust or to entities connected to it. The combined value of these properties, assessed at current rates, was substantial enough that the investigators had, at one point, engaged a specialist in land valuation to verify their arithmetic. The investigation had also confirmed the connection to Pendleton County. Walter Crane's involvement and his subsequent fate had been established to the satisfaction of the investigators, though the report noted carefully that the evidence, while strongly suggestive, does not permit a definitive determination of the circumstances of Crane's death. In addition to Harrow and Pendleton, the investigation had identified two other counties, one in eastern Kentucky and one along the Central Corridor, where similar patterns could be identified in the records. In both cases, the county clerk at the relevant period had a documented professional connection to Vane, and in both cases, significant archival losses had occurred that prevented the full reconstruction of the pattern. The investigation had found evidence suggesting that the network had operated at its peak across at least 4 Kentucky counties simultaneously. It had estimated conservatively that the total number of deaths where Vane's name appeared in Harrow County records alone across the full 30-year period was 47. 47 deaths. One name. The report could not, on the evidence available, conclude that Vane had caused any of the deaths. The physicians' reports were consistent with natural causes in every case. There was no toxicology, no post-mortem analysis, no surviving witness who claimed to have seen anything. What the report could say, and what it said with considerable care and legal precision, was that Vane had been systematically present at deaths that had subsequently benefited his associates, that he had maintained a professional network capable of coordinating the exploitation of these deaths, and that the records of several counties had been compromised in ways that prevented a complete account. The report recommended criminal prosecution on charges of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to defraud landowners. It referred the question of potential additional charges to the district prosecutor. Hector Vane was 84 years old by the time the report was released. He had retired from the county clerk's office in 1868, the year the lawsuit was decided. He had retired quietly without ceremony, having served 31 years, longer than anyone in the county's history. He had, by all accounts, spent his retirement in his house on the eastern edge of the county seat, reading, tending a small garden, and receiving occasional visitors with the measured courtesy of an old man who has made his peace with things. The criminal prosecution was never fully completed. In March of 1871, before the case came to trial, Hector Vane died at home. The cause was recorded by the attending physician as failure of the heart. The death was unremarkable in almost every respect. He was 85 years old, and old men died of heart failure. At the bottom of the death report, as required by county procedure, was the signature of the current county clerk, a young man, newly appointed, who had inherited the office and the ledgers and the records, all of it, from the man who was now gone. Hector Vane's death record was the only one in Harrow County history that bore no counter-signature. No one was present at the examination of remains. Thomas Reed wrote about the Attorney General's report for 3 weeks. His coverage appeared in 5 installments in the Evening Chronicle, the last of which ran on November 12, 1870, under the headline, 30 Years, 47 Names, and 1 Ledger that was never meant to be fully read. He was 40 years old by then. He had spent 7 years on the story, longer than any single story in his career, and he had experienced by the end of it the particular form of exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from prolonged proximity to something that did not resolve in the way that stories are supposed to resolve. The trust had been dissolved by court order in 1869. Its assets, the land, the investments, the accumulated holdings of 30 years, had been placed in receivership while the investigation attempted to trace their ultimate ownership. This process had been complicated by the structure of the trust, which had been designed with considerable sophistication to obscure its beneficial ownership. The investigators had been able to trace portions of the assets to individuals, some of whom were identified and held accountable in civil proceedings, but the full picture had never emerged because too many of the records were gone. That was the other thing Reed wrote about. The records that were missing, the Pendleton County Archives, the 2 additional counties, the documents that would have allowed a complete accounting, had been destroyed or lost before anyone knew to look for them. The investigation could document 31 deaths in Harrow County. It could not know how many deaths had occurred in the other counties because the records were gone. This, Reed wrote, was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire matter. Not the individual crimes, which were in one sense ordinary. Land fraud was not new, and the exploitation of the dead was not new, and the corruption of public officials was not new. What was disturbing was the architecture of disappearance. The fact that someone had understood, from the beginning, that the only real vulnerability in the scheme was the record, and had addressed this vulnerability not by avoiding the record, but by controlling it, by being the record, by making sure that the person who could read the pattern most clearly was the person who had written it. The record is the record, Reed had told Harris years before. It's there. He had believed this absolutely, believed in the documentary power of accumulated fact to outlast the people who had created it. He still believed it. But he believed it with less certainty than he once had, because he had spent 7 years looking at what happened when the keeper of the record was also the author of the harm it documented. He had seen how easily the record could be shaped, curated, thinned, not falsified, not crudely altered, but managed over time by someone with the patience and the access and the will to do it. 47 names in 30 years. Vane's signature on all of them, and what lay beneath, the full weight of what had happened, to how many people, in how many counties across 3 decades, that was still, and would remain, a matter of incomplete knowledge. Margaret Greer was 57 in 1870. She had kept her property. She had kept her father's land and worked it herself, and hired her men, and paid her taxes, and attended the courthouse when she needed to, and watched Hector Vane from across the room with eyes that saw everything and said nothing for 13 years, until Thomas Reed had sat across from her in her front room, and she had decided the time was right. She was asked by Reed, in the last of his interviews with her, whether she felt that justice had been served. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was always quiet before saying something that mattered. "The land is in receivership," she said. "Some of the people who profited from this are facing proceedings. The record has been corrected, as much as it can be corrected." She paused. "But the men who lost their property are still dead. The families who were scattered are still scattered. The families who were displaced from land that had been in their names for a generation, some of them haven't been found, and the records from the other counties are gone. So no," Reed said. "I did not say no," she said. "I said what happened. Justice is not my word for what we have. What we have is a corrected ledger. It is less than justice and more than nothing. And that is the most honest accounting I can give." Reed wrote that down. He used it in his final piece without attribution, because she had asked him not to name her in the final article. She had spent 30 years watching from a safe distance, and she was not ready, quite yet, to be visible in the way that final naming would require. He respected this. He had learned, over 7 years, to respect the careful distances that people maintain when the thing they are watching is still capable of turning around. The Harrow County Courthouse was rebuilt in 1874, following a fire that began in the annex where old records were stored. The fire was attributed, after a brief investigation, to an overturned oil lamp. The records destroyed in the fire were, for the most part, duplicates of documents that had already been entered into evidence in the Attorney General's investigation. Nothing essential was lost. Or so the investigation concluded. Thomas Reed, by then a senior editor at the Evening Chronicle, received a letter about the fire from Eliza Dorn, who had continued covering the story from Cincinnati with the steady determination she had brought to it from the beginning. Her letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph reported the fire. The second noted that the investigation had been conducted by the current county clerk and had concluded in 5 days. The third paragraph contained a single sentence. The current county clerk was appointed in 1868, the year Vane retired. He was trained in record-keeping by Hector Vane personally. Reed put the letter on his desk and looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote back to Dorn. "I know," he wrote. "I have known for 2 years. I have been trying to determine how much of the old pattern transferred with the training." Her response arrived 10 days later. "Enough," she wrote. "I don't know yet how much more than enough, but enough." In the autumn of 1877, a deed researcher named August Rawls was contracted by a Philadelphia investment firm to conduct a title search on a large parcel of Kentucky land that the firm was considering for purchase. The parcel was in Harrow County, one of the last significant tracts of the trust's former holdings that had not yet been fully adjudicated through the receivership process. Rawls was a meticulous man. He had been doing title research for 18 years, and he approached the Harrow County records with the systematic attention of someone who had learned, early in his career, that the most important things in a title chain are often the things that don't quite fit. The gap in a date sequence, the correction that has been corrected, the signature that appears where it shouldn't or doesn't appear where it should. He spent 3 weeks in the courthouse. He found the pattern. Not Vane's pattern. Vane was dead, had been dead for 6 years. The pattern Rawls found was newer, subtler, and in some ways more carefully constructed. It bore the marks of someone who had learned from the previous iteration's mistakes, from the visibility of Vane's personal presence in the death records, from the letter that had survived, from the network of connections that had ultimately been traceable. This new pattern was more diffuse. The name that appeared in the records was not one name but several, rotating, overlapping, each individual involvement seeming unremarkable in isolation. But Rawls was looking for patterns, not individual transactions, and what he saw, laid out across the ledgers of the previous 8 years, was the same underlying logic. Deaths followed by transfers. Transfers followed by consolidation. Consolidation following a line that pointed faintly but clearly toward the same end. He wrote a report for his Philadelphia client and recommended against the purchase. The client declined the purchase. Rawls then wrote a separate letter, not to the Evening Chronicle, whose coverage of the original story he had read carefully before coming to Harrow County, but to Thomas Reed personally, whose name he had found in the masthead and whom he addressed with the directness of one professional to another. "You should know that whatever was happening in this county has not stopped. It has changed shape. It is harder to see and harder to prove, but the logic of it is the same. I believe you will recognize what I have found." He enclosed a 20-page summary of his title research. Reed read it on a Thursday morning in October of 1877. He read it twice. He took it home and read it a third time in the evening, by lamplight, in the room where he had spent 12 years writing about Harrow County and the people who had shaped it and the records they had kept and altered and managed. He recognized what Rawls had found. He recognized it the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you have never met, but whose letters you have been reading for 30 years. Not the letters themselves, because those had changed, but the hand behind them, the logic behind the hand, the particular way that a certain kind of mind organizes the world into something that looks, from any single angle, like nothing more than ordinary paperwork. He was 58 years old. He had spent 15 years on this story. He sat for a long time in the lamplight. Then he wrote 2 letters. The first was to August Rawls, asking him to continue his research and to document everything with the same rigor he had already demonstrated. The second was to Eliza Dorn, who was still at the Western Intelligencer in Cincinnati, who had never stopped watching, who had predicted 2 years before that there was enough of the old pattern left to grow back if the conditions were right. "You were right," he wrote. "It started again, or it never stopped. I cannot yet tell which." The second investigation into Harrow County began in 1878. It was slower and quieter than the first, partly because the principals had learned from the first investigation, and partly because the men conducting it, Reed and Dorn and Rawls, working without the formal apparatus of a lawsuit or an attorney general's office, had only the tools of documentation and publication, which were formidable but not unlimited. By the spring of 1879, they had assembled enough to publish. Reed's final article on Harrow County appeared in the Evening Chronicle on the 14th of April, 1879. It was titled, "With the Particular Weight of a Man Who Had Been Working Toward This Sentence for 30 Years. The name changed, the system did not." The article documented the second iteration of the pattern, the 8 years of quiet activity following Vane's retirement and death. The new network of names, the same underlying logic of deaths and transfers and managed records. It named the current county clerk. It named 2 associated landholders. It named the firm in Louisville that had served, without apparent awareness, as the financial conduit. And in the last paragraph, Reed wrote something he had not written in any of his previous articles, something he had been turning over in his mind for 15 years, since the afternoon in Margaret Greer's front room when she had told him about Hector Vane with the flat precision of a woman who had been holding the truth for too long. "The most dangerous official in any community," he wrote, "is not the one who is openly corrupt, because the openly corrupt can be identified and removed. The most dangerous official is the one who is indistinguishable from the legitimate exercise of his function, the one whose crimes are built into his duties, whose frauds require the same skills as his honest work, whose presence at the scenes of harm is explained by his role and his role alone." In Harrow County, Kentucky, for 30 years, this man was the keeper of the public record. He did not falsify the record, he shaped it. He was there at the beginning of every transaction, and he was there at the end. And the record shows that he was always exactly where he was supposed to be. That is not a coincidence. It is the point. The current county clerk resigned 6 weeks after the article appeared. A state investigation was opened in July of 1879. Thomas Reed did not cover it. He was tired, in the specific way of men who have spent too long close to one story, and he was 59 years old. And the world had moved considerably since the morning he had arrived in Harrow County in October of 1863, looking for a land story, and found instead the quiet, systematic architecture of a man who had decided early in his career, and perhaps without fully naming the decision even, to himself, that the public record was his record, and that the dead could not correct him. Margaret Greer was 66 years old in 1879. She had sold her property the previous year, not to any company, not at a forced price, but in her own time and at her own value, to a farming family from the next county who wanted the land for the same reasons her father had wanted it, because it was good land, well-watered, productive, and worth keeping. She had moved to Louisville. She had taken her leather-bound book with her, and Vane's letter, and the decades of careful observation it represented. She was asked once, by a young woman who had read Reed's articles and come to find her, whether she had ever been afraid. "Every day," she said. But fear and stopping are not the same thing. The young woman wrote this down. It was not destined for a newspaper. She was not a journalist, only someone who had found the story and could not let it go, which was its own kind of record-keeping. She wrote it in a small notebook in her careful hand, and she kept it, and the last entry in the notebook, undated but written sometime in the early 1880s, reads, "The courthouse in Harrow County burned again in 1881. The investigation lasted 3 days. The clerk's records were saved. All other records were lost." And below that, in different ink, as if written later and with a slightly different pen, some names do not leave. What do you think happened in Harrow County? Do you believe everything was ever fully revealed? Or was the deepest part of the story buried in those courthouse fires, lost before anyone could read it? Leave your comment below. If this story sent a chill down your spine, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We have more stories like this one waiting for you. Share this with someone who loves history's darkest corners. And until next time, trust the record, but know who wrote it.